Hey everyone, welcome back to Portal of Wisdom. I'm back today with another story for you. If you are new to the channel, like and subscribe and click that little post notification bell so you get alerted when I post new videos. And now on to today's topic. Today we are going to talk about the Buffalo Hunters bank robbery cache. So, a man named John, he lay dying in a hospital bed in Texas when he recounted a story to his nurse who was caring for him. He was sure he wouldn't make it much longer, so he felt he needed to tell someone his secret. And who better than the nurse that had been caring for him since no one else had come in to visit him, and I don't believe anyone knew exactly who he was, only the name he gave. So it seemed he didn't have any family, or at least none nearby, or none that knew he was in the hospital. And, like I said, the hospital didn't really know his name beyond the name John that he gave them. But when he came into the hospital, he was full of bullet holes and wounds, and those wounds had been festering for a while, and he was not in very good shape. So this man, John, he mentioned to his nurse that a month or so earlier, he was buffalo hunting with two of his best friends named Kelly and Morton. And he said they were all buffalo hunters and they had hunted buffalo for hides and meat to sell. And they were becoming a bit disheartened with their profession since the buffalo herds were disappearing pretty fast now. So I believe this is late 1800s. I don't remember if it gave this specific date. So the buffalo are disappearing pretty fast. One night they're sitting around the campfire in western Kansas, he said. And that's when one of the friends suggested that they rob a bank since they were down to their last $5. And they laughed. But then the seriousness of their monetary situation led to a little more serious discussion on the matter. And what started as a joke turned into a real plan as they went ahead and stopped in Wichita, Kansas as they were coming through. And they camped outside of town for a few days, and they made their way into town to watch a particular bank and the comings and goings of the employees and the bank manager and the customers, and just watching this bank in general. So after 3 or 4 days, they decided that the next morning would be the day. And that next morning, they found the bank manager as he arrived at the bank. And John said he put a pistol to the side of this man's, ribs or whatever, and he made him open the door, and John and Kelly and the manager went inside while Morton stood watch. Within a few minutes, they had a few gold and silver coins, actually quite a few, loaded into canvas sacks. I believe they had a few canvas sacks. And they tied up these sacks, and then they tied up the bank manager and left him behind his desk. It doesn't sound like they really harmed him or meant to do any harm to him. So they quickly made their escape on their horses that they had tied up out back, and they got out of town very fast. And for 2 days they rode south, and they rode pretty fast and pretty hard for a pretty good distance from the bank. And of course they thought there could be a possible posse on their tail that could be after them. So they tried to make haste and make distance. So they only stopped to let the horses drink and graze just a little bit. So the horses were loaded down pretty heavy with this stolen loot, and of course with the outlaws or buffalo hunters that have now become outlaws. So they weren't making as much progress as they had hoped or would have liked, but they eventually did cross the state line into Indian territory. So this tells me this is prior to Oklahoma being a state. And I believe it became a state in 1907. So this is real late 1800s, maybe around 1900 or so. I think it is late 1800s. One day, the three of them they found out that their horses were just wearing out. And I think this was on like day 3. So the horses had been rode too hard. There's too much weight. They weren't stopping enough. They weren't resting the horses enough. And the horses were wearing out and giving out. So they stopped and finally made camp for the night. And they let their horses recover and graze and drink, and it sounds like they unloaded the horses so they could count the money by the campfire. So the horses finally have the weight off of them. They're drinking, they're grazing, they're finally getting to relax a little bit, and the three are sitting by the campfire. And at this point was when they found out that they were about $50,000 richer. So the next day they loaded up again and they decided they were going to head for Texas. But they wanted to conceal their direction by going in erratic directions or not going in a straight line, so that if they were being followed, then their direction or their destination may not be so obvious. So soon, Morton's horse went lame, and he could no longer carry all the weight. So his portion of the loot now needed to be divided up and placed on the remaining 2 horses, and Morton would have to walk now. So this was going to also slow them down. About this time, it said they were next to the Wichita Mountains in Oklahoma, or Indian Territory at that point. And Kelly remembered that he had been in these mountains before, and there was plentiful water and game to hunt, and he figured it would be a good spot for the 3 of them to stop and rest the horses and hunt some wild game, and generally just try to relax a little bit, as it seemed now that the heat was off. And they definitely needed some rest, especially the horses again. So almost right away, though, they were seeing Native Americans watching them from the ridges. So it made them uncomfortable, especially when Kelly recognized them as Comanches. And they were said to be among the most violent tribes on the plains. So they were camped out, the 3 gentlemen were camped out, or 3 outlaws were camped out, for about 3 days, but they never could get enough sleep because of the Comanches nearby. And on day 3, they figured that they just needed to get out of these mountains. And the lame horse was a little bit better by this point, and the lame horse could now walk at a slower pace, and it was loaded down then with its share of the weight. But as they proceeded, they noticed a group of about 40 Comanches following about a mile or 2 behind them. And when they had stopped at a spring for water, the outlaws had a quick drink and they got back on their horses and tried to make some distance between them and the Comanches. And when the Comanches saw this, that they were trying to speed up and get away, they tried to coax more speed out of their horses, the outlaws did, and of course their horses were nowhere near as fresh as the Comanches' horses, who also were not loaded down or carrying any heavy bank robbery loot. So the Comanches, they caught up with them pretty quickly. And Morton's lame horse had had enough at this point, and his horse just dropped onto the grassy ground. So all 3 of the men then took cover behind the fallen animal. And the Comanches were up on them quick now, and the crippled horse tried to get up, so Kelly had to shoot it. And then they took their pistols out and they fired back at the Comanches while the Comanches were firing bullets and arrows at them. And they were just trying to stay protected as much as possible behind this fallen horse. And the Comanches continued to fire their rifles and arrows, but the dead horse did a fairly good job of protecting their position, and it sounds like the men tried to get very low behind the horse. And at one point, Morton, though, he did stand up to take aim at the Comanches, and they got a good shot on him, and he took a bullet to the abdomen. And it sounded like Morton did take out a couple of the Comanches, but his shot to the abdomen for Morton, it started bleeding profusely, and it dropped him next to his friends. So soon the horse that they were hiding behind had taken so many arrows and gunshots that it didn't quite resemble a horse any longer. The outlaws were lucky that they were hunters and they had such a large amount of ammunition and guns. So as dusk settled in, the Comanches retreated to camp that they had set up about 1.5 miles away to the north. Around this time, Morton died of his injuries. So once dark, John and Kelly could see the campfires of the Comanches a ways to the north, and they could tell that they had quit fighting for the night. And so Kelly and John dug a hole with their knives in hands, and they buried Morton right there. So the men sat in the dark, and they pondered what to do. So if they were going to escape, they had to find their horses that had ran off during the attack. And they figured that once they found them, they could escape. But it took quite a while to find them. And as they found them, it sounds like dawn had broke. And they were still loaded down with the loot, and they had to, of course, move Morton's share of the loot onto these two horses, because now the bank robbery loot was going to be split 2 ways, not 3. So they divided it up on the 2 remaining horses, and then they hopped on the horses and they made a break for it. But like I said, the sun was just starting to come up. It was dawn. And since they were weighted down even more now, it was hard to make too much distance, and they only made it 1 mile or 2 before the Comanches were back to continue the fight. So Kelly spotted an old buffalo wallow near the trail, and they headed for it for protection. And it didn't provide a whole lot of protection, but maybe just enough. And they laid on their bellies, and they barely peered over the rim of this buffalo wallow with their rifles and took aim, and they did take out quite a few more Comanches. But John and Kelly did take some bullets too, and they had a good amount of wounds. Around midday, Kelly took a bullet to the face and he was killed. Somehow John was able to maintain his position for the rest of the day, and then at dusk the Comanches retreated back to their camp again, and John again dug a hole to bury a friend. So he buried Kelly in the buffalo wallow, along with his saddle and his rifle and pistol. So John noticed that the 2 remaining horses were grazing nearby on a small rise of the prairie that had a single tree on it, and it was the only visible tree on the prairie for some ways. So John dug a hole, and he buried all of the bank robbery loot here. Then he climbed on one of the remaining horses that was now not weighted down, and he made a break for it. And after a few minutes of leaving that lone tree on that small rise on the prairie, he crossed what he said was West Cache Creek. And he intended to make note of this and the creek's close proximity to the loot. So John kept going towards Texas. He somehow made it over the Red River, and a few days later he made it to Dallas, where he was found lying in the middle of the street, wounded, and was taken to a hospital. So John told the nurse he knew he wasn't going to make it, and he hoped that she could find the money and return it to the bank, as he was sorry for what they did. And John died 2 days later. So a few years later, the nurse had finally left her position at the hospital, and she organized a search party to find the loot. John's directions and details led her to find an area about 4 miles southwest, or approximately west-southwest of Geronimo, Oklahoma. And she searched there, but they were scared away by Native Americans, as it was still not necessarily a safe area. So a few years later, once Indian Territory was opened up for more settlement and eventually became Oklahoma, then she returned again. And she thought she may have found the spot that the outlaws had the shootout behind the dead horse. But she couldn't figure anything else out after that, as John's directions were either too fuzzy or too many years had passed and she just couldn't remember all the details herself. Then in the Lawton, Oklahoma newspaper, the Daily News Republican, on October 18th, 1907, there was an article titled "Human Form Unearthed in Big Pasture." And it told the story of two Cotton County farmers that had found the barrel of a rifle sticking up out of the ground in a pasture. And they dug up the rifle, and then there was a pistol, and then they dug up a saddle, and then they found a skeleton. It was said that the saddle was in pretty good shape, and it was embossed with a name on it, A.E. Kelly. So the farmers, understanding the significance of this find, because maybe they knew the story, but anyhow, it had been floating around maybe a bit at that point. So they wouldn't tell exactly where they found the grave. So they only said it was near an old buffalo wallow, and it was not far from West Cache Creek. So obviously, somewhere nearby would also be a low rise on the prairie with a solitary tree on it, or at least a solitary tree at that point. Probably a lot more trees have been planted in Oklahoma now. In 1910, almost 3 miles north of this approximate location, was found a skeleton at about the exact spot the nurse said she originally believed she found the defensive position, about 4 miles southwest of Geronimo, Oklahoma. But as far as anyone knows, no one has found the bank robbery loot yet. So it's possible it's still out there. It might be on a low rise on the prairie, and as long as the prairie hasn't been tilled up into farming, or the topography hasn't changed much, maybe a low rise will still be visible, although there could very well be more trees in these locations than there were back in the past. So that is the story of the 3 buffalo hunters bank robbery cache.